So, one of the criticisms that Patricia touched on this morning, but I certainly hear from time to time, of market systems approaches is that our field is, and this, one of the criticisms I hear from economists particularly, is that our field is too parochial. You know, we spend too much time talking about livestock vaccinations or fertilizer markets and not enough time talking about transformative economic change that's going to lift millions of people out of poverty. Now, I think Jim mentioned this morning there's been a resurgence of interest in industrial policy, which I think is, in a sense, a response to that policy ambition to be doing something really major. But I think it's worth us addressing this this question, this criticism. And I've got a panel here who are very well placed to do that. Because what they're going to talk about is what actually drives industries to become resilient, inclusive, and competitive. Is it industrial policy, big government, the involvement of big investors, or is it something else? Is it something coming from the grassroots and coming from the bottom up? And that's what we're going to be discussing this afternoon. The person who's going to host that discussion is very well qualified to do that. Soji Apampa is the country director for the Business Innovation Facility in Nigeria. But he's actually got a lot of experience of working with the private sector and with government. Soji.
Thank you very much, Mike. You're welcome back after lunch. And the big question, well, we have two questions that have been put down by Mike. We're going to have two people try to do justice to the issue. First, to my right is James Foster. He's a director of Africa programs for Gatsby. He's overseen their work in Tanzanian cotton and textile sectors. He had 10 years working experience in East Africa before joining the Gatsby Foundation. And to his right, we also have Stuart. Stuart Worsley has worked for 30 years in international development. Recently, he co-authored a book with Danny Burns of IDS titled Navigating Complexity in International Development. So both of them are going to spend some time discussing the topic. But I think we should start from James. The big question is transformative economic change possible at scale without a negotiated involvement of certain institutional stakeholders, like governments, like government funding agencies, like getting elite buy-in? Over to you, James.
Thank you, Soji. Can everyone hear me? No. Can everyone hear me now? I have to apologize. My voice has been gone and it's now coming back slowly. So if I sound like Bob Dylan, I apologize. I won't sing. Before I get started, Soji has asked me to do a icebreaker or a warm-up because we're in the graveyard slot after lunch. So, as I lived for 10 years in East Africa, and no good East African conference is complete without a good clapping ritual, please will you all stand up and warm your hands up. So warm your hands up. We're going to create a thunderstorm for some rain for Zambians because the cotton sector needs it desperately. So I want you to start with one finger and tap your hand. You hear the little rain, pitter patter. Okay, 2 fingers. It's getting heavy. 3 fingers. Very nice. Whole hand. All right. And very good, thank you. So we've given some rain to the cotton crops. So I'm from Gatsby. Just to give you a brief introduction about Gatsby, it's a private foundation from David Sainsbury, ex-chairman of the supermarket chain, and then since then he was 10 years in government as the Minister of Science and Innovation. in the DTI. Gatsby's been involved in East Africa for 30 years, mainly focused on agricultural research and development, with a bit of work as well on SME development. In the last 7 or 8 years, we've evolved significantly to focus on sector development, what we're calling sector development, which is in effect market systems development in the language of today. So Gatsby has a sort of pretty strong commercial orientation, but also, with David Sainsbury's background in government, a strong reflection on the drivers of government and the need for governments to be involved in stimulating growth. We're a funder and an implementer, so we have our own cash. We can take a long-term and patient approach. We can be adaptive and flexible. And we focus actually solely on East Africa. So we only work in Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, and Tanzania. We work in cotton, textiles, forestry, tea, and now aquaculture. We also support an entity which we created in Kenya called Kenya Markets Trust, which works in 5 other sectors: dairy, livestock, inputs, water, and seed. So that's about Gatsby. But the main aim of today is to talk about the cotton sector and to draw some lessons from that. Unlike Stuart, who's going to talk after me, Gatsby doesn't have a long, successful portfolio of programs. We're at an early stage. And we've experienced a lot of challenges in that early stage. So I'm going to talk about some of those challenges and try to draw some lessons from them. First sort of lesson I'm going to try and draw out, which everyone knows in the room, is that markets do not function by themselves anywhere. My voice is going. So, in some cases, markets might function for a little while independently or in isolation. But in fact, in all cases, at some point, they will face challenges and risks. Challenges to changes in demand or what have you. As a result, they need constant monitoring and they need to be maintained. I'll give an example of the Tanzanian and the Zambian cotton sectors. Secondly, to be successful in the long run, markets need to be competitive, they need to be inclusive, and they need to be resilient. We've all used those terms a lot, and at Gatsby we've got a specific meaning for what we mean by those terms, and I'll go through those. But resilience, I think, is the one that we'll focus on most. And thirdly, that there's a role for government. Whether we like it or not, government is critical to sector development, to market development, and to creating the conditions for market systems to work. So I'll start by talking about cotton. Briefly, I'm sure most of you have seen cotton growing in the ground, have tried working in cotton, or are at least aware of the crop itself. It's primarily a smallholder crop, at least in Africa. It's grown in relatively dry areas, so not the best growing conditions, and so therefore it's actually a pretty strong pro-poor crop. It's heavily susceptible to pests, so farmers in general need pesticides to deal with it. And while it's not a particularly high value crop, it's relatively drought tolerant, so farmers still plant it and like it. But they do generally need credit, and the standard system is that they get credit for their inputs, seed and pesticide, which is the norm. As it's non-perishable, cotton can be transported long distances, which means that even a ginnery or a cotton processing unit operating 100 kilometers from the cotton farmer can still buy its crop, which means that competition can be severe. At the same time, processing units for cotton can be very, very small, or they can be tens of millions of dollars. So you've got low barriers to entry. When we first started working in cotton in 2008 in Tanzania, the sector was effectively beautifully organized, or to all intents and purposes beautifully organized. You've got the structures in place that could make a sector really work and be dynamic. There are representative associations of farmers, representative associations of ginners. There's a regulatory board that oversaw the buying practices. There's an industry trust fund that takes a levy on the crop at the end of the season, which ginners and farmers jointly contribute to. And that levy funds seed and pesticides for the next season, but also collaborative research and even extension services. So those were the sort of structures that were in place. Despite that, the cotton sector was in crisis. The trust fund is bankrupt, effectively. Most ginners have not been forced to pay, or some of the ginners have not been forced to pay their contributions. The Research Institute has produced a good new seed, but it can't be commercialized. The government policy and regulatory environment on the seed multiplication system isn't working. And as a result, you don't have this seed being distributed or commercialized. Farmers receive almost no training in good agricultural practices. And as a result, the processors are selling low quality, adulterated cotton to international markets at a discount. Their throughput in the ginneries is on average around 25%, which is pretty shocking for their profitability. And the conversion ratio of seed cotton to lint is about 30% less than the East and Southern African average. So ginners are not making much profit, farmers are not getting good yields, and the sector is gradually dying. Despite this, the industry is not doing anything about it. It's just walking gradually into collapse. So since 2008, Gatsby's been working with the government to try and support the seed research side of things to get better seeds in there that would help both farmers and ginners. We've worked on good agricultural practices targeted to the lake zone to try and improve farmer productivity. We've created now a markets system for inputs, in fact, broader than cotton, in all crops. Working also on the sort of service provision for tractor services and so on. But the main thing we've been trying to do, which is the really crucial aspect of what will save the cotton sector, is to try and sort out the regulatory environment, working with the government. And this has involved trying to pilot models of contract farming, which have ginners providing support to farmers directly, rather than with funding coming in from the trust fund. And it's involved also working with local governments to sort of oversee those relationships, and working with national government to try and set the minimum criteria. As I'll show you when I undo this, this has been the production of seed cotton in Tanzania in recent years. As you can see, it's not particularly stable, to say the least. What you find is that in periods where there's been a very strong and successful institutional structure created, which was the initial one back in 2002-03, where they had a very good system of providing these inputs to ginners who would then pass them on to farmers, and it worked on an annual basis. It worked for a few years to deliver growth. What happened was the system got undermined, vested interests came in, started to undermine the actual relationship between the ginners and the farmers with side selling and side buying, and so the system collapsed. Again, you see a spike again in 2007 and 8 where the same situation happened. In 2010-11, when Gatsby first came on the scene, we were able to help create contract farming. We did a few pilots, it seemed to work. The government said, right, let's roll it out nationally. The pilots weren't really ready to go. They were pretty small scale. They were effective to some extent, but they weren't really testing the nitty-gritty of how things can work in practice. The government tried to roll it out. Huge spike in production because every farmer got inputs and more inputs than they've ever had before. But as a result, the interest in the sector, the political economy issues in the sector came back, and the ginners that were then asked to sort of start funding the inputs themselves decided that this was a bad idea. So again, the farmers' access to inputs has declined and continues to decline now to this day. So that's the situation. We have seen some progress in recent years where the ginners particularly, but also the farmers are willing to now fight a little bit for this seed system to start working. Because seed is an easy win. It supports the farmer's productivity, supports the ginner's productivity, and it supports the overall quality, which should result in a higher price. So everyone can see a direct and immediate benefit to seed working. But contract farming is tougher. You've got your entrenched interests in the sector, the ginners, and they're a mixed bag. Some of the ginners have a very long-term vision. They've invested $10 million or more in their ginneries, in their processing units, and they see the picture. They see that the cotton crop decline is going to kill them. It's going to kill their business, and they've got this massive asset that's underutilized. So they are trying to work with farmers, and we've been working with a number of them to try to drive models that can then be replicated elsewhere. The challenge is that on the other side of the fence you have a lot of very small ginners, very small operators, or even medium-scale operators, but who are not particularly financially solid. They probably don't have audited annual accounts, let's say, and they certainly don't really have access to sufficient working capital to put money into farmers at the start of the season, planting season that is, and recoup it 10 months later. As a result, they're very, very resistant to this change that the government and the rest of the stakeholders are keen to drive through. So we've been battling this for a few years now and trying to build coalitions of the willing, if you like, to support the change. But it's still proving very difficult, and it really comes down to whether the government is going to be willing to take tough decisions. The government's going to need to actually say, right, we're going to force this industry to adopt these minimum standards, these minimum requirements, and by doing so, we'll probably cut the size of the industry in terms of the number of ginners, but we'll make it less competitive, actually, and it will allow the ginners to therefore supply farmers with the inputs that they need. So the conclusion from Tanzania really is that we've been unable to effect change from a sort of gradual building of a cohort of people and a cohort of opinion around what needs to be done. But it really needs the government to buy into it, and we've got to get that change through the government. If I just go quickly onto Zambia to give you a sort of counterpoint, I've got explanations here on what's caused the change at the different times, but I won't go into those. And for Zambia, we have a similar story. Not quite so stark as Tanzania, perhaps, but probably even more disappointing in many respects. So in the late 90s, you had a big crash in the production of cotton in Zambia. Competition in the industry with new ginners coming in led to the fact that existing ginners could no longer supply inputs to farmers. Without inputs, farmers stopped planting cotton, grew maize or whatever instead, and the production crashed. Once the production crashed, some of the ginners left the industry. Those ginners that were left received quite a lot of international aid and support to boost this farmer supply systems again. So farmer support services with pesticides, with seed, with training, and with better collection systems, started to see an increase again in production. As the production increased, again you had interest from other ginners, other players re-entering the sector, coming back, or new ones starting. And again, the sector itself, without government support, was unable to constrain the side selling in these issues that are bound. And what you have is back down to a crash again. Very, very low production. The ginners' profitability is destroyed. Farmers receive probably a lower price, but also there are other factors going on with international prices and with the devaluation of the kwacha at the same time, and even obviously weather has a major play. But effectively, the support from the donors up to that period in 2007 had some impact, but then that impact has disappeared. And the same thing happened again up to 2011. Again, you see significant support with matching grant funding and so on of ginners in Zambia from international donors, leading to much greater supply of inputs and of seed and pesticide to farmers, and the crash again at the end. So this is the situation. It needs proper regulation of the industry, and unless you can get that regulation, you're in trouble. So for Gatsby, we've come to the conclusion that there are three key aspects that you need to see in any development program: competitiveness, inclusiveness, and resilience. And I'll focus just very, very briefly on resilience. The idea of resilience is that you've got a market system, you've got all the nested market systems around it. But if you look at that at the point at which some of these investments started in Zambia, it looked like it could sustain itself. It looked like by supporting into the industry is creating the services to farmers that are sustainable. In fact, that status quo of that competitive, inclusive system wasn't there. You need to also engage in the resilience of the system by working with the government, by working with the private sector and the actors to create stabilizers around the market system that will enable it to create the conditions for competitiveness, for inclusiveness into the long run. And this is one of the things that we've been struggling with, we've been grappling with in Tanzania. But it's that resilience, that sort of resilient structures, if you like, or the institutions that will be able to adapt in light of challenges, in light of risks and shocks to the system that we need to also address, which doesn't seem to be a strong feature of many market development programs and hasn't been until recently at Gatsby. So that's all I wanted to say. My voice is just held. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, James. Stuart will now look at the other half of the equation. Is there anything else possible bottom-up? Stuart.
Hello, my name is Stuart Worsley. I'm the director for Mercy Corps in Ethiopia. I want to tell you a story, and I want to tell you a story about how change happened through movement. Movement matters. I believe very strongly through the professional experience that I've had in my life that if people don't give a damn about the work that we're doing, they're not going to engage. And when they do give a damn, they do engage. So very quickly, my presentation is going to do this. I want to review development processes. I want to talk about a story of transformational change. I want to have a quick reflection of what works and why. I published a book recently with Danny Burns of IDS. It will be on sale tomorrow. Here it is over there. It's on the screen. The story I'm going to tell you is in here in a far greater level of detail, and there are 5 or 6 other stories. The book is basically telling us what works through evidence of what has happened rather than some ideological conjecture of what might be able to happen. I'm going to start with the position is that planned development has not worked. We've been talking about complex systems here, and I'm getting somewhat concerned that people seem to still think that a complex system is ultimately predictable. It's not. It's random. Yeah. And yet we still persist in making plans and making linear interventions and assuming predictability. And we have wonderful instruments called logical frameworks, and we've got adaptations of logical frameworks called theory of change, and somebody's going to shoot me for saying that afterwards. But the bottom line is that $135 billion US has been invested in development assistance since development assistance has started, and according to some meta-evaluations, we have a negative return on investment. And I think one of the things why this is we need to understand how change happens. In complex systems, I just want to point out a few things because this underpins the nature of my story. The first thing is everything is connected to everything. So what happens over here has an influence of what happens over there. As a result of that, complex systems are emergent, and they are incredibly unpredictable. We're able to look back over our shoulder and get a sense of what happened and why things happened, but to actually say that ahead of time, you need to be a soothsayer. Complex systems are dynamic. They're always changing. They never stand still. But there's hope. There are patterns formed by attractors within complex systems that you can begin to tease out. And if you begin to poke these using iterative approaches, you can begin to nudge change processes. And I want to talk about a nudging change process. And that nudging process is what I call fostering movement. Did I jump 2 slides? Yep, that's it. The framework that we use in describing our theories, the top blob up there, is that if you have participation, learning, and networks, you get the creation of this poking of systems which makes the work that we do ultimately fit for purpose. It is adapted because farmers, for example, work with technologies and make it work for them, and they own it and they love it, and then it goes viral and it goes to scale. And it gets viral and goes to scale with this combination of ownership's appropriateness leading to sustainability and scale, which leads to what we call system transformation. So here's my story. There's a small market in the north of Kenya at a place called Lolguniani. And to give you a sense of Lolguniani, I don't know if people know the geography of Kenya. It's up in the north. They call it ASAL, which stands for arid and semi-arid lands. It's disconnected. It's ignored. It's been politically subdued for a very long time. The Kenyans that live up there are routinely in the newspapers not referred to as Kenyans. They're referred to as herdsmen. They are transhumant. They move from place to place. They take their cattle with them wherever they go. And it's a denigrated way of life. There's a lot of people in Nairobi who think it would be much better if all of this was a game park, because then we could get some tourist dollars in. Transhumant life is denigrated. It is regarded as bad. So we decided, I was working for a group called SNV, that's the Netherlands Development Organization, previous employer, where this story comes from. We assumed that the issue here with cattle marketing was that quality was an issue. We thought, well, let's intervene in this area, give these guys a good piece of income. Let's see if we can improve the quality. And we had a hypothesis that if we were able to fatten them up by feedlot management, and if we were able to vaccinate them against contagious bovine pleuropneumonia, if we were able to vaccinate them against Rift Valley fever, and we were able to get a trucking process in, we would be able to increase gross margins by 29%. So we did a partnership with the Osceola Holy Ground Users Association, and we opened shop. We had this big multi-hectare site with grass and hay all stacked up, and vets with vaccines, and the cows all came in, and we had a holding space of 3,000 animals. At the end of the first week, only 50 had showed up, and we thought, well, what's going on here? Why? And Thomas Wary, who was the guy who was handling this particular account, he came to me and he said, well, what do we do? So I said, well, look, take a car and let's run around and talk to pastoralists. He said, but I've been speaking to all the pastoralist associations. I said, forget the pastoralist associations, speak to pastoralists. Go and find a guy living in a tent with some cows and some sheep and some goats and ask him why he hasn't brought, or why she hasn't brought her cows to market. So he did. And he came back and he said, I'll depart from my slides for a minute. He came back with the following thing. He said, you know, when we sell our animals, only about 5% of them are ready for market. And that is because we have a herd which has got a herd structure. Well, we've got males and females in young stock and old stock, and we've got our genetic potential which we store over here, and we dribble them out onto the market, and we're not actually organized in order to produce. Now, what you're offering us at 29% gross margins improvement, yeah, you're absolutely right. It will absolutely work, but it's only going to work for 5 out of my 100 animals, and so, basically it's not worth my while. If I do that, I have to leave my herd boy behind to look after the animal, and then I take my 95 out onto the rangelands, and my left flank has got no protection, and if I fall asleep under a rock, then I've lost half my animals because, well, I haven't got my herd boy. So, 5 animals, it's not worth it. So, but they said, but we do know what the issue is. So Thomas said, well, what? And he said, well, it's about the marketplace. We've got this market. It's in a place called Lolkuniani. It's a bare patch of ground. Only people that get into this are traders. And these are guys, they're petty traders, and they accumulate livestock down the value chain. There are frequent security incidents and attacks. If we take our animals here, the chances that we're going to get knocked on the head with a piece of wood and our money taken is quite high. There's an excessive taxation system. Every time we move our cattle across a district boundary, we have to pay cess. It's just not worth the effort, so we don't do it. But we feel that if we could manage the market, if we could co-manage the market, we could do this. So we could make a difference. So we brokered a conversation between the Samburu County Council and the town clerk and a representative group of these traders, and they made an offer. And the offer was this: allow us to co-manage the market, allow us to collect tax on your behalf, which is what is they normally, the council would tax every transaction. Allow us to collect that tax, and we'll split it with you 50-50. But in return, we will double the volumes at least. So you should be able to get exactly the same revenue that you're getting before, but you don't have the hassle of managing the market. We will manage it. Do we have a deal? Well, I don't know whether the town clerk was having a bad day because he did quite an illegal thing. He said yes. Because the law of Kenya does not allow you to do that. The markets have to be run by the county councils. It's a gazetted law. But this guy said, okay, you've got 3 months. What they did was within 2 weeks, they tripled takings. They tripled volumes. After 6 months, that market was pulling in 44,000 euros worth of turnover. After 2 years, it was 1.25 million euros worth of turnover, which was coming in the forms of a much more diverse livestock base. It was no longer just sheep and goats, it was now camels, it was donkeys. When I went to visit the market, there were fence structures, it was organized. There would have been probably about 1,000 people there on a market day. There were trucks. There was a school that got built in the area because this became a viable place for people to settle. There was a water supply which had now been dug with a new and very expensive borehole. There was 300 micro-enterprises now which had been set up, and these micro-enterprises were providing food for the marketplace, were providing veterinary supplies, providing groceries and dry goods. There was a banking system. We had a small mobile branch of Equity Bank which had opened up. And all of this happened in a place where there had been absolutely nothing before. It was an emergent outcome. The emergence, I want to give you an example of how the emergence happened. It started with trucks coming up from Mombasa. These trucks started creating a greater demand, so people could have more livestock to sell. But that increased security incidences. So in order to respond to that, M-Pesa was invoked with mobile phone payments. M-Pesa is capped at 70,000 shillings, which is, in those days, was about $900, which is, if you've got more than 3 cattle to sell, it ain't much use. So in came Equity Bank, and they came in with a mobile banking platform where people could use their mobile phones and they could squirt their money into the equity system and go back and keep on transacting. So you had this intermeshing coming up of services which happened. It was an emergent outcome. Nobody designed this. It happened. This model became so successful that the Standard newspaper came up and they sent a journalist up to have a look at it, and it hit the national news. We facilitated linkages through this, through the Kenya Livestock Marketing Council. This was a network of livestock actors across the country we were using them to be able to take the story to other parts of the country. And as a result of this, 9 other areas then came in and started to do copycat operations, and it spread to those. And the story ends some years later with the Ministry of Agriculture having gazetted a change in national law of the local councils, that no longer is it required for local councils to be the ones that run markets, but they can now co-managed. And secondly, the Ministry of Agriculture invested over 1 billion shillings in the development of markets around the country. Now, how did all of this happen? And I want to give you just a couple of thoughts. I've just scribbled them up here. My story is that one thing leads to another. There's a sense of discovery and learning that as people are beginning to figure out what works and what doesn't work, they move on to a new thing. It built on relationships and networks. It worked with multiple actors across the whole system. It worked with multiple strands. We didn't have one master plan, or they didn't have one master plan. We were working just with one group. There was parallel little lines with the banking and the vets and the fence building. There was lots and lots of parallel and some convergent actions that were happening. It reached a tipping point, I think, because the benefits were visible. People were working with their own enthusiasm and their own passions. The visible benefits where we thought they might be, well, in a way, I don't know what I meant by that. Let's go to the next one. There was a change in local law. There was linking to other markets. There was the power of the media and of news. And of course, there was a change in national law. So in my framework that I put up at the beginning, I want to just look at this here, and I think these 7 elements are absolutely critical if you want to have whole system transformation. The first one, participation. The people within the system have an intimate knowledge of what works and what doesn't work. And even if they are so-called ignorant pastoralists, they are far from ignorant. They live in that political nexus where there is this interaction of taxation and ecological fragility and of contagious bovine pleuropneumonia and all of these things and school fees that have to be paid. They live at that place, and they have a profound knowledge and understanding, one, and secondly, they have a profound reason to do something about it. So that participation here, I hear the word participation talked about very much as a thing that we do in order to speak with people. This is not participation about blah, blah, blah. This is about participation in action. It's about people doing together. The second element here is the learning. So as you do this action research type of approach where you're trying to figure out what works and what doesn't work, trial and error, you begin to get evidence about what works and what doesn't. Feeding that through networks begins to pass that far and wide. It generates appropriate action, it gives ownership. The scale that follows is a natural viral spread. And if you do that and you begin to change the system attractors, like the law in this case, you get sustainability, a change system pattern which is permanent. That's my story, and I hope you find it interesting. Thank you.
Well, there you have it. So we've just begun the debate. I mean, I don't know if you got the same thing out of both extremes. The first is, how does change happen? Are we going to plan the change in the way we normally do with market systems? Or are we going to nurture the change? How exactly does change happen? Because James made the very clear point, and the very valid point in the case of Tanzania and Zambia, okay, that without government intervention, whatever you did only traveled so far and then lost momentum. And without having institutions like financial institutions working, and for the kind of scale you're looking at, you need some kind of government funding and financing in there. Can you really sustain the change you're looking for? But you've seen a totally different approach, where it's all about a spark. So it leads me to the second question, which is that, is it really in a system about the constraints or about finding the right levers? So how do you define the boundaries of that system that you've decided that you're going to work on or study? Who decides that? And thirdly, in trying to bring about the change, who do you work with? Who are the actors? Because you can see in the two examples, they're very different, and they're at two very different extremes. So we're going to have a very interactive session now, and we're going to take those questions one after the other. So the first question being, exactly how do you imagine that change will occur? Is it going to be planned, as we've learned? Or do you think there's room for creating these kind of movements and having change more nurtured than planned? Can we have mics? And would anybody like to respond to that? Yeah, there's someone right there.
Yes, thank you very much, James, Stuart, and Soji. I'm Bill Grant from DAI. It's a question of where you start. You know, I think having identified your problem is a good critical starting point. And then you can say, well, my theory of change is X, and I'm going to try and test it by doing something. But then you always have to keep retesting that hypothesis. And we've got some great cases in Nigeria where something worked very well in one specific situation with one group of actors. And it was taking off very nicely, but when we tried it somewhere else, it didn't work at all. But we said, well, why isn't it working? Oh, the market environment is different. We talked to some of the actors, and they said, well, what about this? Why don't you try that? And so a new model developed. It came out of the other model, but it's an adaptive process, as you said, Stuart. I agree completely with that process. And I am a planner by nature. But it's also, if I've got a vision for where I want to get to, it's how do we test and assess and constantly go back and test our theory of change. Because a theory of change is a guideline. It's a theory. And is it going to work? But I think that if we do the right kind of internal introspection, we can keep coming up with something isn't working, the fail fast thing. Yes, we tried it, didn't work. What did we learn? Let's try something else. or else we get out of it altogether. But I think that it's a combination of knowing where you would like to get to, which is a much more dynamic trading market of animals in northern Kenya, and then what are the ways we could get there and not be locked into one or the other. Thanks.
Okay, there's a lady at this table here, just here.
I'm always thinking of plans as something that you can throw away, and you have continue. I mean, you need plans but they also serve a purpose to a certain extent, and things change continuously. And so, the second thing I thought that I want to share is that these plans should be owned by those whose change it is about, and that's very much Stuart's point. It's that participation and active participation and active research, action research, is extremely important. A third thought I would like to share is that different contexts need different entry points and different strategies and different kinds of plans. Saying that everything can do without plans and no government involvement or central planning is needed, I think is a little bit too ambitious, because probably in the context of James, it requires some government involvement at a certain point. And government is there for a reason, so it's also one of the stakeholders. So I would say probably in the context of the pastoralists, there's much more glue among the pastoralists. It's an assumption I make. I don't know the context of Kenya and your project, but there's probably much more glue among the pastoralists and a common kind of strategy and I don't know, than among farmers, perhaps not, yeah? But it's a different context probably that require different key stakeholders to engage at certain moments. But I would say participation is probably key, and plans are there to be thrown away, and continuous monitoring is there to be agile and adapt to new situations.
So the question is it about contexts, or is it about approaches? I think there was someone who wanted to... Yes, the lady just here.
Thank you. Just to follow on from the points that were just made, I think Stuart's kind of closing question to us is, are we planning change or are we nurturing change? And I suppose it's a bit of both, because I think to nurture change, we have to plan that intentionally. We have to invest in that nurturing. And something that was said this morning, I think, was a very good context for our 2 days together, which was Patricia from DFID reminding us of the political economy that development operates in, which is the need for short-term results. And that's why we get pushed into planning for change that we can measure and be very sure about. But it takes us into all sorts of places where we don't want to be, and that statistic that Stuart put up at the beginning about basically how ineffective overseas development assistance has been is perhaps some proof of that, and that's what this kind of investment in systems change is about. But I think this is a really helpful reminder of where are we putting the investment in. Yes, we can plan, but we need to put investment in that nurturing, and it perhaps requires us to do different things and to have different skills.
Okay, what I'm hearing is that it's not about whether it's planned or nurtured, it's actually how you combine both. Does anybody agree with that? Do we have green cards, amber cards, red cards? Okay, so who else would like to make a contribution on that first point? Good. Okay, there's a gentleman right in this corner here.
I think that's, James, what you're trying to say with the, resilience, getting the government active role to kind of like stabilize the change. I think I agree very much, because the reality is that in most developing countries, the role of government is really, really big. You know, it's like sometimes missing the big elephant in the room. you know. Now, the problem is that when we talk about incentive structure for behavior change, if we use that lens and look at market players, it's much easier to see where they want to go. Let's say bottom line, that's like one of the criteria. New market, new products, you know, new customers and so on. But with government people, it's completely different, right? They're not attracted to that bottom line. Maybe they're attracted to the potential to get re-elected in the next election. Maybe this connected with the business of the nephew or the, I don't know, the second son from the third wife or something like that, right? Or maybe this is something a little bit altruistic motive, you know. A person has been in the government for the last 20, 30 years. The person wants to retire, want to leave a very good legacy, right? So I find it very difficult, although we all acknowledge that is one important thing, but I find it very difficult to be able to analyze that and to find the right levers to trigger the change. Now, I'd be grateful if you could elaborate a little bit how you did that in your case. Thank you.
Okay. James, did you want to take that? Sure. Yeah.
Does this work? Great. So I guess one response to the general conversation and then coming to you, I think from what we've seen and what I would have had time to present would have been that we're not saying you plan everything. We're saying that you need to nurture, you need to adapt, you need to identify your vision, you need to try and work out ways to get there. But you need to focus as well while you're building your pathways to success, to a competitive and inclusive sector. You need to build in systems that will enable the sector to adapt the institutions, adapt the rules of the game as change occurs in the market conditions or in the play itself. So back in the Zambia example, as the sector grew in terms of success and production, more firms entered the market, which changed the dynamics of the market system completely, which meant that the sort of competitiveness and inclusiveness was very difficult. So unless you've got resilient systems and changes that can adapt, you can't succeed. In terms of how you do that, I guess what we've tried in Tanzania and cotton is to build a coalition of those jinners that are very keen to see change. We've worked with them to develop models and systems of contract farming that work or that are showing signs of working. But it's then trying to tip that into a bigger, scaling that up. It requires the tough government decision. In other sectors, it's a bit easier, where more of the players are aligned behind it. In Stuart's example, they all see the benefit. All the farmers in the group see the benefit of, or all the herdsmen, to use your phrase, you know, see the benefit in changing the market structure to enable them to get benefits. But if you had the agents who were previously selling the livestock in the market, I would imagine they probably didn't see such a benefit to it, or there would be some people that perhaps lost out. And if they have stronger voices, if they have a bigger position in society and they can stop the change, then you're in trouble. And that's what we're finding in the cotton sector in Tanzania, is that while we may have a cohort of people that are keen on the change, if there are others that have also got power that can block it, you've got to find ways around that. And so the sort of method we've been trying now is to do some very intense econometric modeling of what the change might do for local governments, what the change might do for national government revenues, for exports, etc., to try and convince top levels of government that this issue is actually one they should take seriously. But we don't have a silver bullet, I'm afraid.
I'm coming to you, Stuart, just now. Is it just about whether or not you involve government? Because I can see that in your case study, government was also involved. Or is it more about the how you bring government in and the role you expect government to play?
I think the issue is that we're not trying to predetermine which actors should or should not be involved. They are there, and therefore they have to be worked with. I would take a slightly different point of view, and if I just pick you up on something you just said there. When the unexpected happens, it is my sense that the movement of people, because it's not the experts that know what the solutions are, it's the people who live with the pain of poverty that know what those solutions are. And when you get the enthusiasm from them to step up to the plate and start tackling an issue, I think you then get some rather interesting processes which begin to happen. I don't think it's a matter of saying, well, that's going to be the responsibility of government. Government only responds when there is reason for them to respond. Governments are political organizations, and if they need to win elections, and if the people hate them because they are messing up the cotton sector, then the chances are that that might affect their election challenges. So the issue of trying to keep people happy, I think, is an important element that I think the participation of people through action and the building of movement around things that matter to people's lives, I think is really important. But could I just pick up a couple of the other comments?
Very quickly.
Very quickly. Where do you start? I think you start by asking the right question. And I think as experts we come in and we ask the wrong questions because we perceive problems that we as experts see as the problem. So you start with the right question, and I think you get into a completely different space. Alison, you said, are we planning change or are we nurturing change? And I think it was Adelina, you said something about throwing away plans. You know, I've got a motto which I use, which is don't make plans, but never stop planning. And I think the idea is that you need to keep planning. You need to keep on thinking, what's going to happen tomorrow? We know tomorrow is unpredictable, but keep on planning and keep on thinking and keep on working and throw yesterday's plan out if it doesn't work. So the point here is I think there is this hybrid here which is not about plans are bad. It's that planning is an essential thing of what we have to do, but we need to be very careful about locking and loading stuff into preordained hypotheses. The other one is just back to Bill Grant. You said that things don't spread. I would just put in your mind and take a conversation up with you afterwards. Scaling and rollout are completely different things. If you want to take things to scale, they rarely work by rolling them out. If you want things to go to scale, you have to change the system dynamics where the spread is viral. And I'm convinced that it's about working and finding out what system patterns need to be pushed in order for that viral tipping point to happen.
Stuart, I think that's an excellent segue into the next area. That is it really about constraints, or is it really about finding those leverage points? You know, what is it that we need to do to disrupt the system so that it could go viral in the way Stuart has talked about? How do we define that system in itself? What is that system? Who should define the system that we're studying or they're going to work with? Who's going to do that? Or rather, who ought to be doing that? Yep, there's a gentleman right at the end.
Thank you. I think one of the biggest challenges is that we tend to spend a lot of time analyzing the contextual analysis of the groups that are the least affected. For example, in a market system, a lot of investment goes into analyzing the challenges that business is facing, the challenges that enterprises are facing, but minimum effort goes to assessing and spending time on the challenges that affect the most affected. So, for example, I think a good starting point is a text that has just been written by Darryl Collins on, is it Portfolios of the Poor, where you get to understand what exactly are the issues there. So it also helps to understand at that level, how do they understand the system at that particular level? And we begin to unlock some of the challenges from that point of view. And I believe at that stage, that's when you can actually trigger scale and be able to influence scale.
Okay. Did you want to respond to that, either of you?
I call it working from the point of pain. If the shoe pinches, you start by changing your shoes. You don't change your hat. And I think the issue here is finding out finding out where it hurts is the start of creating movement that spreads.
Okay, so is it a different way of defining the word constraint then? Because many who are doing market analyses are looking for the constraints, but I'm not sure they look at it in terms of where the shoe pinches. They just look for where is the market underperforming for the poor. It sort of sounds like two different ways of looking at it. One appears a bit more bottom-up and the other top-down. So let me put the question out to you then. So in trying to identify those constraints then, which way should we go? More bottom-up planning or thinking, or is it more of the top-down analysis, at least in the initial plans? What do you think? I think I've asked a hard question. Okay, at the same time, the gentleman here and then the gentleman in red, but as the mic is getting to you, we should also think of who are the right people for us to partner with in our interventions. We should start thinking about that as well.
I think, basing on your question, I think it...
sorry, it was the gentleman here.
Oh, all right, that's fine.
Sorry about
that. When we talk about systemic constraints, I guess, the point that you're raising about, where do we start? So when we're selecting a sector, we are already taking the lens of opportunity first, because we're thinking about a sector where we can have a proposed growth, and then we're talking about why it's not happening, so that's leading to systemic constraint. So eventually, I would say that we do take into consideration the opportunities first, and that should be the way of doing it. But a key question that has been laid forward is, about the systemic constraint. More often than not, we come across projects which are addressing the same constraints worldwide. We're talking about, things over and over again, same things, and leading on to projects and interventions which are mostly training interventions. So the question then is, if everything leads to training and demonstration and whatnot, then probably we're defining the wrong thing as systemic constraints. So what we need to shed light on is, how do we define our systemic constraints and what exactly we are talking about as systemic constraints, which is eventually the triggering point for the intervention.
Okay, the last contribution. Yeah.
Now, I was just saying that I don't think there's any real difference between pain point and the constraints where we, in a market system approach that we research. The idea is that you start with the people in the value chain. And people in the value chain, because your ultimate beneficiaries are the poor. So you look at them, investigate exactly what it is that's happening to them, and you identify the pain point. So I'm struggling to see the difference between what happens in the market system approach that we're pushing and this pain point you are referring to. I don't see a difference, because in my own little experience, that's what has happened. I look at the farmers, I look at what their issues are, I invite them to discuss this with me and to say, okay, this is the direction I should go to, and I design together with them an intervention that really hopefully will move us towards the towards resolving the problems that with the constraints we're trying to resolve. So I'm struggling to see the difference between this market system approach and the pinpoint Stewart referred to.
Okay. Okay, Collins, really last one, please.
Thank you. I might be wrong, therefore don't throw any shoes at me. When people talk about systemic constraints, there tend to be, or there is normally a tendency to focus on constraints that prevent maybe one farm or a group of farms from accessing certain markets or certain services. But when I really look at the real systemic constraints that really stop the poor from participating, they tend to be very much value chain governance constraints. And if that is the case, in most cases, you cannot determine that by either doing too much of analysis and designing. It is understood better by actually participating in the market and getting the trust of the people who are involved to share really why they are stopping this part of the chain from working. So given that, then, I would say that getting people to participate, getting to be part of the system for you to understand those governance issues will unlock the system to enable others to participate. That is my, and sorry, don't throw another shoe.
Okay, so Stuart, do you want to have any closing comments?
Collins and I used to work together in South Sudan, and we coined a phrase, making the path by walking. And because it's the way that the path through the bush is formed. It's not a planner that comes, it's the passage of people that makes the path. The gentleman in the middle, you mentioned about, you say that what is the difference between the point of pain as experienced by the poor versus the point of pain as perceived by the expert. You know, I've been around this game for about 30 years. I'm getting old. My hair will show it, like Jim Tamburn says, we're becoming the old farts of the future. Of today. But in my time, I have seen development frameworks that alternatively focus on food, democracy, security, climate, ecology, human rights, and so on and so forth. And every time we take one of these frameworks and we examine a particular context, suddenly the problems pop up because they become problematic within the framework that we've just looked at them. And quite often we do not find that the problems that we perceive to be problems are problems that are actually shared by the poor. So that would be my first point. I think therefore you need to ask whose issue and whose problem. Tanya Murray-Lee, who wrote an anthropological book, classified development issues as being that experts come and we look at systems through our lenses and we problematize what we see. Having problematized what we see, we render them technically because we know how to deal with technical issues. We don't know how to deal with political issues, and we don't do politics because we're development workers. So we technically render everything that we find. And then we act on behalf of the poor in trusteeship, and they never quite graduate from being trustee we remain perpetual custodians. We do not empower the poor. And I think that this combination of then we change the framework and we've got a new set of problems and therefore the poor don't know what to do and we start all over again. And I think it's this issue of expert-led development and the creation of plans that we think that we can shape the world in the way that people it is good for those people. I think that is where the problem is. And so what I'm therefore pleading is yes, experts do have something to say, but my God, it should be subordinate to what local people have to say because it is their pain, it is their passion, it is their future.
James? Yeah.
Thank you. Just to contrast, I suppose, I would say that you can nurture models, you can adapt those models, and you can seek to identify your constraints in the most participatory way. But when it comes to actually making changes happen and taking them to scale, it's very hard to do that without really understanding the political economy of the sectors, getting into the governance structures of the institutions that are part of the sector or part of the market system, and therefore being a player in trying to help the sector to build its ability to influence change in the long run. Thank you.
Just the final word for me, just to say that at the end of the day, it's about changing institutions. And you should ask yourself the question, is it possible to change institutions without affecting the power structures? Is it possible to change institutions without engaging the current holders of different decisions within those institutions? So whether you're planning it or you're nurturing it, I think somehow you still have to think about institutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I just thought it was really funny how James ended with "in contrast." So everyone still has differing views. But can I just say this was exactly the point of the conference. We wanted it to be interactive. We wanted to hear the different opinions, different views, and please take this conversation forward. Whatever has started today, let's continue this, and that's the whole point.